Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining this event from the Society for Black Neuropsychology. I'm Dr. Day O'Shea, Chair of the Education Committee. Welcome again to our series on brain health at every age. If you missed it or just want to relive the amazing content from our earlier talks, make sure to check out the recorded videos on SBN's YouTube and Facebook. For part 4, our final event of the series, I'm so happy to introduce Dr. Jeremy Grant, who'll be presenting to us about midlife brain health. Jeremy, we're not getting your audio coming.
Oh, there we go. Yep, I was muted. I'll start over again. All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks again for having me. My name is Dr. Jeremy Grant. I'm coming to you from the University of Florida. I'm a part of the Brain Health Equity and Dementia Prevention Lab and a postdoctoral fellow there. And I also did my PhD at Wayne State University in Detroit. And yeah, just really happy to be here. Really passionate about brain health and promoting brain health, particularly in the communities that need it the most, particularly marginalized communities. And so today, I just want to really provide a summary and just a recap of many of the topics that we've already talked about this week. Today's presentation will particularly touch on, just very general brain health strategies that you probably already have some awareness of. On Monday, we heard from Dr. Ray talk to us about prenatal brain health. We also heard from Dr. Sakina Butt yesterday about brain health in childhood. And we also heard from Dr. Yanka Reed about brain health in adulthood. My guess, in older adulthood, I should say, my guess is that for most of the people watching, you probably don't fall exactly in any of those age categories. My guess is that most of you fall in the category of someone that we would consider midlife, someone that we would consider to be in this kind of middle age range. You're younger than the age of 64, you're an adult. And oftentimes when it comes to brain health, it's really important to think about our children. It's really important to think about our parents, but what about ourselves? What can we do today to promote our own brain health? So in a moment, I'm just gonna, there we go, thank you. So I'd like to start with just a little activity, particularly for those of you who are streaming live on YouTube, or for those of you who might be streaming this later. 2 truths and a lie. 3 statements on the screen. 2 of these statements are true. 1 of these statements is a lie, or at least misleading. Take a moment to think about it. You can pause it if you want to think about it some more if you're watching this later. But for those of you who are watching live, you can also, I'd love to see your comments in the chat or on YouTube or on Facebook. But which one of these statements do you think is the lie? In Alzheimer's disease, the very first thing that changes is a person's memory abilities. Statement number 1. Statement number 2, Black Americans are twice as likely to have Alzheimer's disease than white Americans. And then statement number 3, there is no cure for Alzheimer's disease. Which one of these do you think is the lie? I'll give you a moment to think about it, or to pause it if you're streaming this later, before I proceed with the answer. And the answer is the first one, that we know from a bunch of research that memory problems aren't actually the first thing or the very first thing that happens in Alzheimer's disease, that there are a whole host of biological changes in Alzheimer's disease that occur years, even decades before any noticeable memory problems are present. So we've heard a little bit about Alzheimer's disease already this week. And just to give a little bit of a recap for anyone who doesn't know as much, when we say Alzheimer's disease, we're referring primarily to this disease that affects or that is caused by a buildup of various harmful proteins in the brain that particularly affect the connections between our neurons and eventually lead to the death or the neurodegeneration, the loss of those neurons, particularly or usually in an area of the brain called the hippocampus, which is the part of the brain that's involved in long-term memory storage. And I say usually because it can affect other parts of the brain as well. And I'll show you a very research oriented slide, a very kind of detailed and scientific slide. And I won't go into too much detail. But for most people, when we think about Alzheimer's disease and dementias, what we're thinking about is really someone's ability to function. That's when someone's ability to be impaired, when they can't take care of themselves, when they can't, drive or take care of their medications or take care of their finances or be trusted to live alone. That's really when we give someone the diagnosis of dementia. And so over here on this graph, when we say clinical function, this line here in brown, that's what most people that I speak to are usually concerned about is that aspect am I able to function? That's what we think about when we think about dementia. And sometime before that, there's usually some notable or noticeable changes in cognition, memory or problem solving or some other aspect of a person's thinking abilities changes or starts to get worse. And that's probably the other main area that most people think about when we think about Alzheimer's disease. We think about memory loss, someone losing their ability to remember things. But as you can see here, without going into too much detail, there's a whole host of biological changes that happen way before memory problems or a loss of clinical function. And there's still lots of debate. There's still lots of research going on about what change happens first, what protein is responsible for what. But we know that overall, that there's these biological changes happen for any memory problems. And so when it comes to preventing dementia or promoting brain health, it isn't enough to just say, oh, well, you got to get on that when you start having memory problems. Or, once I get to about 65, I got to really work on my brain health. As we've seen throughout the presentations this week, brain health is really a lifelong endeavor, and particularly for these diseases of aging, which are so common in our community, in Black communities. It's really, really important to be in the preventative side and to take steps earlier on in life, particularly during midlife as an adult, to protect your brain health. And so maybe you're thinking, all right, I have to start preventing cognitive decline at least a decade before, I'm at risk for Alzheimer's disease. So maybe in my 50s, something like that. If Alzheimer's disease traditionally or typically starts in the 60s, and maybe you're thinking, yeah, all right, I still have time. Maybe you're in your 20s, your 30s, 40s, and thinking, I still have time. It's still so important to start thinking about brain health as early as possible for all the reasons that have been these talks earlier this week, but also because there's other disorders. It's not just Alzheimer's disease that can affect your brain. There's other kinds of disorders that can impact your brain at any age. You can have a concussion or a more serious brain injury at any age, riding your bike, perhaps a car accident, anything. And after a concussion or a more severe brain injury, it's the same brain health recommendations that will often be made. Or there's other diseases. In particular, I'll mention one that you'll hear about a little bit later: multiple sclerosis, which is a disorder that kind of starts with the immune system and then results in the loss of part of our neurons, yeah, a part of our brain cells. And that disease is known to start between the ages of 20 and 30. In my dissertation research, the average age of onset was right around 35. So there's more than just Alzheimer's disease when we think about these disorders that can affect our brains and really impacts our brain health. And also, like was mentioned earlier this week, and I think it was Dr. Butt yesterday, and I know Dr. Bird was saying the same thing, that there's more to brain health than just avoiding disease. There's a positive side to it as well. There's a side to it that speaks on just being able to live your life in the most effective way possible and do the best at your job, or do the best you can for your family, or do the best in just every aspect of your life. And all of that is really controlled by our brains. So three important facts that really changed my perspective and really got me really interested in this work. That, as we mentioned, that these biological changes in Alzheimer's disease and other disorders start for noticeable memory problems. Secondly, as we know, Black Americans, this is a true statement, are more likely to have Alzheimer's disease than other racial groups, particularly here in the United States. And it's not, or there's still ongoing research to really find out why exactly that is the case. But the most of the research evidence suggests that it's not because of the melanin in our skin that somehow impacts our brain, but has more to do with how the melanin in our skin causes us to be treated by society, particularly on a systemic level. Particularly when we think about systemic racism, residential segregation, different historical and current forces, social forces that lead us to be more at risk for worse health outcomes in a variety of different disorders. I did my PhD in Detroit, as I mentioned, and I often look at this map, a redlining map from 1939 and a map from 80 years later, 2019, and you can see that the areas of the city that were more disadvantaged back then are still the ones that are disadvantaged now, and these are the places where diseases like Alzheimer's disease are more common, and these are places that have lower school quality, lower access to high quality healthcare, lower access to healthy food options, and all these kinds of societal forces really put our brain health at risk, particularly as Black people. And lastly, as is kind of obvious but is worth repeating, there is no cure for Alzheimer's disease. And importantly, when they are working on a cure, when these various pharmaceutical companies are designing their clinical trials and trying to find a cure, oftentimes they don't have us in mind. And by us, I mean Black people. We are systematically underrepresented in these trials. And really, it's really that medical providers, myself included, have not done a good enough job building trust with Black communities to be fully involved and trusting in research and these kinds of clinical trials to help find a cure. So promoting brain health, getting involved in research, learning as much as we can about how to live well cognitively and in other aspects of our lives is super important for everyone, and particularly important for Black communities. And today, I just want to share a few steps that you can take today, no matter what your age is, to really promote your brain health. And some of these have been mentioned already this week. I'm just going to focus really for the sake of time on the first three that I think apply most well to people in this age group, midlife, someone who's an adult, your 30s, 40s, 50s, before your 60s, these kinds of ages. If you don't hear anything else that is said today, if you don't hear anything else that was said this week, remember this: what's good for your heart is good for your brain. And a more scientific way of saying that is what's good for your circulatory system is good for your brain health, right? That pretty much all of the functions in your body rely on some kind of nutrients, whether it be oxygen, whether it be glucose. Your whole body runs on nutrients, and your circulatory system is really the way that these nutrients get to various places in your body. And without a well-functioning circulatory system, you're going to have all kinds of different adverse health outcomes, and that's particularly important for your brain. Your brain is only, on average, about 2% of a person's body weight, but takes up about 20% of the amount of oxygen that comes into the body. So it's really the part of the brain that's really driving a whole lot. And so anything that affects the transmission or the transportation of oxygen and other nutrients to your brain is definitely going to have adverse health effects. And so when it comes to particularly protecting your circulatory system, particularly for Black Americans, it's important to watch out for these chronic health conditions: high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes. You can go back and watch Dr. Reed's presentation and learn about these in greater detail. But I think it bears mentioning that we've become so used to hearing of these disorders. If I was in a crowd for this presentation, and I were to ask you to raise your hand if you knew someone with one of these conditions, I'm pretty sure everyone knows someone who has these conditions. They're just so common, and particularly common in our communities, but they're really, really silent killers. A abnormal buildup of pressure in your arteries, or an abnormal buildup of plaque through cholesterol, and particularly through diet, can be really, really detrimental for a variety of different health outcomes, but particularly for strokes, for having some kind of blockage or some kind of bleed in your brain. That's really the mechanism through which it usually happens. And these are the same risk factors for having a heart attack. It's the same risk factors, just a different place in your body. And so we call these cerebrovascular risk factors. These are cerebro as in referring to your brain, and vascular referring to the blood vessels. So risk factors for diseases affecting the circulation of the blood to your brain. And so that's probably the first thing you have to take care of, is making sure that the blood flow to your brain is as optimal as possible and isn't hindered by any of these chronic conditions. And not just for concerns about having a stroke and losing the ability to speak temporarily, and the importance of recognizing the signs of a stroke, but very importantly, mini strokes, or less, or perhaps undetectable strokes that kind of build up over time. There's lots of research suggesting that is really the mechanism through which these racial disparities in various brain health outcomes manifest themselves. It's these mini strokes, or this buildup of these cerebrovascular risk factors over time. And so we know that, we know about that in adulthood, but it's so important to recognize that this has also been shown to be important in midlife. We know that there's research showing that being overweight in young adulthood, or having two vascular risk factors in young adulthood or midlife, is associated with cognitive decline decades later. There's also research showing that for Latinx and white adults, brain aging is worse in later life than in midlife. But among Black adults in our communities, accelerated brain aging really begins in midlife. That's really the key age where these disparities take place. And we also know that a person's exposure to residential segregation in young adulthood is associated with various brain health outcomes and cognitive decline in later life. So the extent to which you've lived in a neighborhood that is disadvantaged or doesn't have good resources, even in your young adult years, is related to things that can happen to your brain decades later. And so, if the first step is to manage those chronic health conditions, and to watch out for any diseases that affect the circulation of your of nutrients and of blood to your brain, really the next step is to do things that can really not just prevent disease in your circulatory system, but boost the function of your circulatory system. And so, really, the main way we can do that is physical activity. We know that physical activity boosts the brain in at least two ways, if not more, but by improving blood flow to the brain, and also helping with the release of chemicals that help build new brain cells in the hippocampus, the part of the brain that is responsible for long-term memory. Here's just one example of a whole ton of research showing the benefits of physical exercise, just showing in a large sample of individuals who were tested over the course of a year. And on top, you have in blue a group of individuals who exercised and did aerobic exercise, that is, exercise that really got their hearts pumping. And then those who just did stretching, who did some movement, but it was just kind of a stretching kind of exercise. And you can see on the y-axis here that hippocampal volume, the size of a person's hippocampus, grew, particularly for the individuals in the aerobic exercise group. So just showing, we used to believe that you could not build new brain cells in your hippocampus or in your brain as an adult, that all of that happened in childhood. But now we know that through certain lifestyle activities, particularly exercise, you can actually boost your brain development physically, even as an adult or as an older adult. And so it's important to focus on aerobic exercise. Any exercise that increases your heart rate, makes you breathe in more oxygen, gets your blood flow going, improves the functioning of your heart and of the rest of your circulatory system. Things like just going for a brisk walk, or even better, something like jogging perhaps, or hiking, or swimming, or particularly water aerobics if you have mobility difficulties. Less important the type of exercise, more important that it gets your heart pumping and gets your circulatory system, improves the function of your circulatory system. Another way of looking at it, another quick thing that you can take away, is to see if you're doing the right intensity of exercise, is talking and singing. So if you're doing exercise and you want to protect your brain health, and you can talk and sing during your exercise, it's probably a little bit too light of an exercise. If you can't talk and can't sing, well, you're probably doing something, pretty strenuous, and that's not necessarily necessary. We want people to practice a moderate level of exercise. That is where you can speak in full sentences, but you're not so comfortable that you can sing a full song. That right in that moderate level is what most research suggests is best for protecting our brain health. The third of the first three that I really want to focus on today, these steps to brain health, is cognitive activity. And another little activity for you, so you can pause this if you're watching on YouTube later. Taking a look at these two MRI scans, which person do you think has worse memory? Which person do you think has worse memory function? Or I could even say, which person do you think has dementia? It's a little bit of a trick question because we can't exactly tell, particularly when it comes to dementia, just on based on a brain scan, how well someone's brain is functioning. It's a correlate of a person's function, but I cannot look at these brain scans and say, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the person on the left is functioning better than the person on the right, even though there's a little bit more changes in the hippocampus for the person on the right. In order to really see how someone's memory is doing, I have to do some kind of assessment, or I have to see their function in day-to-day life. And this is an important point because oftentimes for many individuals there can be a disconnect between what their brain looks like on an MRI scan and their actual functioning in real life. It's not a one-to-one relationship. And one of the main explanations for any discrepancy between the amount of brain damage someone shows on a scan and their actual functioning or their memory abilities in real life is this theory of cognitive reserve. It's this idea that some people develop more efficient brain networks than others due to various life experiences, and that people with more efficient brain networks can withstand a higher amount of brain damage before their memory is effective. It's kind of like, I think of the analogy of putting money in a savings account for a rainy day. That throughout, your life, you put away money in a savings account so that if there's a rainy day, if there's some big expense you have to make, you're not gonna have to go bankrupt because you have money in a savings account. You have money saved away. In the same way, throughout our lives, we can put away kind of savings in our cognitive bank so that if we experience some kind of disease later on in life, that we're less affected than other people. And one of the main ways that we think about this concept of reserve, of building up a reserve over the course of our lifespans, is through formal education. We know that individuals who have more years of schooling, people who have gone further in school, tend to have better outcomes for across a variety of neurological disorders or a variety of brain health metrics than people who haven't done as much schooling. But it's important to note that there's many ways of building cognitive reserve outside of just formal education. It's not being in a school or getting a grade that helps boost your brain development, but really it's the thinking, it's challenging your mind while in school, that theoretically we think is related to these better outcomes. And so it follows that you can also build up your mind and challenge your mind outside of school. So if you're saying to yourself, "Oh man, I didn't graduate from high school. Am I at greater risk for some kind of neurological disorder in the future?" The truth is, yeah, you might be, but there is something you can do about it. As a quick example, from my own dissertation, I was studying people with multiple sclerosis, and we examined people who had a high education quality as well as people who had low education quality, and also examined individuals who had high cognitive enrichment. That is to say, they did a lot of cognitively stimulating activities across their lifespan, or particularly for this study, we were looking at in young adulthood. And what we found was that for individuals with high education quality, if you went far in school or had a good education quality, that you performed kind of similarly to those who just had a good cognitive enrichment. Really, the group that was really different was those who had low educational quality and didn't do a whole lot of cognitively enriching activities outside of school. But those individuals who did have low education quality, but also did a lot with their brains and did a lot of healthy brain leisure activities, performed similarly to those who got that reserve through formal education. So, just one example of how even if you have a low level education and you might be at greater risk for some of these brain health metrics, in some studies, there is something you can do about it. You can do healthy brain activities to boost your brain development and protect your brain health. Another famous example of this is the London taxi driver study. I don't know if you've ever been to London, but that is a gigantic city. I lived there as a child and was there just in October visiting some family, and was taking in just how many streets and different little nooks and crannies that these taxi drivers have to drive through. And in order to be a taxi driver in London, they have to pass a test called the Knowledge, which requires learning over 26,000 streets and points of interest, all without a GPS. And neuroimaging studies have shown that London taxi drivers have a larger hippocampi, the part of the brain involved in memory. That part of the brain is larger in these taxi drivers than the average population, and also larger than London bus drivers. Now, why might that be the case? Well, one easy hypothesis is that when you're driving a bus, you kind of drive the same route over and over again. Whereas when you're driving a taxi, you have to constantly adjust. You have to constantly update the map in your mind. It's a little bit more cognitively demanding. And so what this shows is that even beyond education, having a cognitively challenging job can really help build your brain health. And also, the key thing here is to raise the level of challenge and to focus on activities that involve learning a new skill or constantly updating your skills, not just activities that you already know how to do well, like a bus driver who drives the same route over and over again. And so some activities that we commonly recommend are anything related to music or language, learning a new musical instrument, learning a new language, learning from seminars and workshops outside of school, like this one. There's even research on things like going to art shows or museums that theoretically relate to cognitive reserve. It's important to do new things, seek out new activities, particularly since Alzheimer's disease and many other disorders hurt connections between brain cells. So it follows that the most important thing to do to protect your brain health is to build new as many new connections between brain cells as possible. And that comes from learning new skills, not just activities that you already know how to do well. So those are really the three main things that I think really you can take away from this week. If you're in your 30s, 40s, 50s, that you can start today to really protect your brain health. I'll briefly just touch on some other important ones that have been mentioned throughout this week. The importance of eating well. The average American diet is really not good for our brain health. And there's a lot of research showing that the Mediterranean diet, a diet that's high in fruits and vegetables and some kinds of seafood and grains and nuts, is really what's best for our brain health. Either that or variants of this Mediterranean diet. Also, the importance of sleeping well cannot be overstated, particularly in this technology driven age. It is so hard for so many of us to get good sleep. And I have to confess, when it comes to these brain health strategies, exercise, I've got it. Cognitive stimulation, I've got that. Nutrition, I'm pretty good at that. But really, for me, it's the sleep. Anyone who knows me knows that, yeah, this is really the area where I'm struggling to really get that high quality sleep. The most important thing is to do things that will help train your brain to sleep well, and so that you can feel rested in the morning. And there's much more that could be said here at another time. And then lastly, the importance of social activity, which is probably a surprising one for many, but there's so much research showing that People who have a good sense of community, as was mentioned this week, a strong sense of purpose is related to so many better health outcomes across the board, including for brain health and neurodegenerative disease. And it can even show up on neuroimaging scans. And so finding community wherever you are, through hobbies, through religious organizations, through volunteering, whether it be church, whether it be through workshops, whether it be through any other community organization. Finding community and finding purpose is such an important way to protect your brain health and also to combine many of these brain health strategies. It's so much easier to be consistent at working out when you're doing so with other people. It's so much better, easier to be diligent when it comes to nutrition when you have other people keeping you accountable. And so combining these brain health activities with other people is super, super important. And related to social activity is also the importance of, the negative side of social activity is people who are lonely. We know that people who are lonely and don't feel that sense of community have much worse outcomes. And loneliness is also related to our mental health and depression, as well as anxiety and other forms of mental health problems. And we know that people who get help for these kinds of mental health problems through therapy, which is something that is often frowned upon either explicitly or implicitly in our communities. Therapy can be an important way of fighting these different problems that hurt our brain health. It is not. It is extremely common for me as a neuropsychologist to see people come into our clinics, come into our office who are concerned about their memory functioning, only for us to find out that they're tremendously stressed, or that there's some immense trauma or some immense problem, or that there's been some chronic sadness or loss in their lives that's really clouding their minds and really taking up their cognitive resources and not enabling them to use their minds right. That's really in the way and contributing to these memory problems. So it's important to take all of these resources, all of these brain health strategies into account, and to build yourself up in all of these different dimensions. I'll just show a few more resources that you can use if you're interested in learning more about brain health. A few different books that are by neuropsychologists, experts in this field, to say more in greater detail about these different brain health strategies, and have some really, really good scientific information as well as practical information that you can apply to your daily life today. And so with that, looking forward to answering your questions, comments, and criticisms. Our lab at the University of Florida is doing a lot of research right now on these kinds of brain health strategies. So in fact, we have a research study on exercise and medication adherence in people who are at risk for cognitive decline. If you'd like to find out more about this, I encourage you to visit our website. And I encourage you to visit the SBN website as well if you're interested in these talks or would like to get connected with a neuropsychologist to promote your own brain health. But thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Grant. What a great talk. So much information there. And I think really easy for us to understand what we could be doing right now to improve our brain health. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the quality of education information that you presented to us. Can you explain a little bit more if that was formal years of education only? Are there other indicators of enrichment or quality of education that we should be paying attention to?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Properly assessing quality of education is such a challenging thing, particularly when you're working with people's, retrospective reports of what they think their school was like, 10, 20 years before. And everyone seems to think that their quality of education was pretty good. In my research, we looked at it primarily through two lenses. Uh, uh, Someone's level of education, and specifically in that graph that I was showing, we looked at quality of education as assessed by their actual objective reading performance. So there's plenty of work by Dr. Jennifer Manley and others showing that if you assess someone's ability to recognize words that get increasingly more complex, that can be a good way of assessing theoretically the amount of information someone has actually learned in school, rather than just looking at the number of years they spent in school. So quantity versus quality.
Right. And I know we all want to know, we've heard earlier in this week about brain health, even prenatally, brain health in kids. So can you tell us again, is it too late for us in midlife?
Yeah, it is not too late. It is not too late. As we've been talking about, brain health is a lifelong endeavor. It's not something that just starts when you start having memory problems or when you're getting older. And it's certainly important to examine it from the before you're born and as you're a child. And there's certainly lots of factors that influence that trajectory. Yeah, long that are outside of a person's control a lot of the times, but there is a lot that we can do that is within our control, and particularly, this kind of midlife age range has been shown by multiple research studies to be the age range that is most important, or really the age range that really drives these disparities in brain health outcomes, particularly when it comes to Black communities. So, there's a balance between these social forces that put us at risk for having worse outcomes, but there is still a lot that we can do that's starting today to promote our brain health.
Right. Thank you so much. So again, that's really our goal with this series. We've heard about brain health at every age, some of the factors that contribute to health, both current and what we can do to prevent and promote health into the future. So I do want to note a comment in the box. You have a new Twitter follower. And so for everyone, be sure to follow Dr. Jeremy Grant on Twitter, as well as the Society for Black Neuropsychology Twitter as well. We do have all of these videos from our brain health series available, recorded on YouTube, and will also be on Facebook as well. So you can follow us there. So that concludes our series for Brain Awareness Week. We hope that you enjoyed. Any additional comments that you have for us, please make sure to follow and comment on Twitter, and follow our Society for Black Neuropsychology email list as well. Right. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.